just firstly, I mean, we've been getting a lot of views in the last hour from our audience saying that many of them lifelong Conservative voters. Keith says, I've been a lifelong supporter of the Conservative Party. I will not vote for them in the next general election because of Rishi Sunak. I mean, is that a possible worry, even though he may have more confidence from the Parliamentary Conservative Party, that many of the people that voted for the Conservatives in 2019 have lost confidence?
Well, it's certainly a danger, but my question to the people saying they'd never vote for Rishi Sunak would be, would they vote for Liz Truss either? And in all cases, I think it's important not to confuse noise with volume. People who are upset about Boris Johnson not being on the ticket, Boris Johnson not being Prime Minister, are certainly out there. And they may be making a lot of noise, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are particularly numerous in their proportion of the population. And so, yes, this certainly excites people. It certainly gets people's blood boiling in some cases. But Rishi Sunak has consistently proved to be the more popular of the candidates among the general public.
Looking at the polls, there's been a new poll pushed by the Penny Mordaunt campaign this morning saying that the public sees her as more likeable and that in some areas of what they call the red wall, she's seen as polling the best, as the most likely to pick up votes amongst people who know who she is. How much can we buy into this sort of polling that campaigns themselves release? Because often it's quite selective, isn't it?
Campaigns conduct polls on a whole host of different subjects, and they choose to release the polls that they think will help them, and that's what a campaign does, and that's true whether it's a political campaign or indeed a commercial company or an advertising campaign. And they use pollsters like us, and indeed that is us in that particular instance, to conduct their work and find out what the public think, and so that's what they've done in this instance.
And what do you make of the results of that poll? Because this emphasis on likability is an interesting one. It's not often one we hear about politicians. But
it is a valid question to ask, particularly with the Conservatives in such a difficult position in public opinion terms as they are at the moment. And it was often said that Boris Johnson, certainly in the years prior to becoming Prime Minister, certainly when he was London Mayor, for instance, he was seen as a very likeable, jovial chap. He was someone that people would like to go out for a drink with, and that was something that was repeated time and again. And so to ask the question about whether people think that the different candidates are likeable is certainly a valid question. Obviously, there is then the question about how that translates into support at the ballot box, but you don't know that until someone is in the leadership position and how they resonate with the general public. But certainly someone who is seen as likeable at the beginning starts from a much better position than someone who is seen as dislikable.
And on that point about likability, I mean, if Rishi Sunak does become the Prime Minister, he will, of course, then be up against Keir Starmer. And in that sense, is there much personality differences in terms of the perception of the public? I mean, they're both seen as quite managerial, quite serious, not very different kinds of leaders to Boris Johnson.
Well, what I would say is, yes, they're both very different types of leaders to Boris Johnson, but for many people in this country, that is seen as a strong positive. Keir Starmer has consistently emphasised his competence as one of his most positive traits, and Rishi Sunak, during the leadership campaign, I'm sure if he goes on to win during his time as Prime Minister, will attempt the same things. And yes, that is very different from Boris Johnson, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. The other thing that I would say about Rishi Sunak, and to a lesser extent still Keir Starmer, is that both people are relatively unknown. Boris Johnson was a major figure in public life before he even became Mayor of London, let alone before he became Prime Minister. And so Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are very different from him in that respect as well. Keir Starmer has been leader of the Labour Party for a number of years now, but certainly the early period of that time was dominated by the pandemic, when there wasn't really the opportunity to to communicate with the general public in the same way that there is now. And Rishi Sunak, yes, again, he came to the front during the pandemic, but before that really wasn't known at all, and really still is only known for that. And so it will be an interesting period in British politics. In that of the two, Keir Starmer is the best well known, but he himself is not particularly well known at all. And how that exactly plays out in polling will be interesting to see.
And yet the polling, as it stands, shows the Labour Party at least 30 points ahead of the Conservative Party, almost unprecedented poll leads. Can we expect that to change off the back of a new Prime Minister? Is it reasonable to expect, is it likely to expect, a poll bounce for the new Prime Minister?
Well, both reasonable and likely are interesting terms. If you look at these things historically, you see that generally speaking, when people do take over, they do benefit from a small, modest bounce, usually between sort of 2 and 5 points in the polls. That wasn't true for Liz Truss, and the circumstances this time around are very unusual in that Rishi Sunak is coming to the job so soon after Liz Truss came to the job, but also coming to the job, if he wins, having previously lost the leadership election just a few weeks ago, and so we don't know how things will play out. But my sense is that given just how badly the Conservative Party is performing in the polls at the moment by historical standards, but particularly how incredibly poor Liz Truss's own personal ratings were as leader, I think it's likely that there will be some recovery simply by virtue of the fact that they are at a historically low position that is unlikely to continue.